Welcome to Cars Yeah, show number 2237. We continue this week with our In Memoriam shows. Today I'm going to bring you a replay of my talk with the great Quick Vic Elford. What a racer, what a life. I hope you enjoy this show. Be prepared to be inspired.
No matter what the car, what I was driving in, I always expected to win.
This is Cars Yeah, where you'll enjoy interviews with inspiring automotive enthusiasts. Mark Green is here to provide you with a fuel injection of automotive inspiration. So get in, sit down, buckle up, and get ready for a wild ride here on Cars Yeah.
Hello, automotive enthusiasts. Today I am so excited to introduce a very special guest, Vic Elford. Vic, are you buckled up and ready for a fun ride?
Oh, absolutely. Always ready to go.
All right. Great to have you here. Vic Elford was one of the fastest drivers of the 60s and 70s and is a racing icon in Porsche's history. He's arguably the most versatile all-around driver of all time, and he's raced and won pretty much every motoring event in Europe and the United States, including the Monte Carlo Rally, the Daytona 24 Hours, Targa Florio, Nürburgring 1,000 kilometers, Sebring, and the European Rally Championship. And then he moved to Formula One, Can-Am, Trans Am, off-road racing in Africa, and even NASCAR. In addition to Porsche, Vic's raced for almost every marque and set speed records and lap records around the globe. He drove for Steve McQueen in the movie Le Mans. He's authored books, narrated Michael Kaiser's film, The Speed Merchants, and he still participates in many motoring and vintage racing events today. Vic, I've told our listeners just a little bit about your incredible history in racing. Would you take a moment and share a little bit more about your history, your career, your interests, and your passion for automobiles?
Well, you already gave a broad outline. It's very difficult to know where to go from there because, as you said, it all interests me.
Yes.
Where do we start? I suppose we have to go all the way back to the beginning when I was, I was born before World War II, so I'm getting quite ancient now. Today, of course, it's different. Today, when the kids who are passionate about motor racing or who start to be interested in motor racing, if they're that interested, they can now be driving go-karts almost before they can walk.
Sure.
But back in my day, that sort of thing didn't exist. There were, the only people who went motor racing back then were wealthy young gentlemen who could afford it. The idea of actually being a professional driver was just like a pie in the sky dream.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it started right after World War II. My father, who prior to the war had actually been quite a good road racing cyclist.
Oh, wow.
So I guess to a certain extent racing was there in my blood to be just stirred up a little bit. And in 1949, Formula One Grand Prix racing came back to life again after the war, and my dad took me to see the very first ever British Grand Prix after World War II.
Oh, wow.
We sat in the grandstands at Stoke Corner, which is still there. It's still part of the track. And I remember seeing those marvelous, colourful, noisy, fantastically fast machines coming down Hanger Straight toward me. I was 14 years old then. I was actually just about 13 and a half years old.
Uh-huh.
And I saw that, heard it, and said, that's what I'm going to do. Of course, at that time, I had no idea, because it was just a dream,
Sure.
People couldn't go motor racing, but I kept the dream alive, and ultimately it happened.
Well, how did you get into that first step of being involved in motor racing? There must have been some pivotal moment or thing that happened that enabled you to do that.
Oh, there was indeed, absolutely. My best friend in high school was a guy named Alec Rhodes, and we were friends for many years in high school. And one day his mother won a sort of a small edition of the jackpot.
Oh, okay.
There was a big sweepstake in the United Kingdom then called the Irish Sweepstake, and it was rather like the lotteries. It was
Yes.
there for a purpose. In Florida, for example, our Florida lottery is for education.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of the Irish sweepstake, it was a hospital sweepstake. All the profits went to hospitals in Northern Ireland.
Okay.
And his mother won a portion of that. I mean, not a multi-million-dollar portion, but enough so that my friend Alec finished up with a nice new MGTF sports car out of the deal.
All right.
And he was interested. He wasn't mad about it, but he was interested in motorsport, as indeed was I. So he decided he would start doing rallies. And to do rallies, he needed a navigator, co-driver. So being his best friend, I got the job. So at least I was sitting in a rally car, not on the correct side of the car, but at least I was in it.
Yes.
And then from there, I moved on to another partner, David Siegel Morris, who was a friend for many years, who had greater ambitions. In other words, he wanted to go to international rallies, and I was with him for a couple of years. And eventually we drove for the Triumph factory team, and then for the BMC, British Motor Corporation factory team in Minis and Austin Healey 3000s.
Uh-huh.
And I made no secret of the fact that I preferred to be a driver. I was there because I could do it being a co-driver, and eventually Marcus Chambers, who was the well-known boss of BMC rally team and competitions, fired me. I later learned that the reason he told me he fired me because he didn't want co-drivers who wanted to be drivers. And then later on, he told me that one of the reasons he fired me was because he felt that I needed a push to actually get on doing something on my own.
Yeah.
And that was one way of making sure it happened.
Wow, very cool.
As part of the deal, prior to being fired, I had already told him that I had saved up enough money and I wanted to buy one of the ex-factory Minis.
Oh.
Not even the Mini Cooper, just the original 850 Mini that we were driving then. He promised he would sell me one as soon as it became available. And he kept his word. He sold me the car. He put in a brand new racing engine in it for me so that I could go racing. So my very first race car was an ex-works 850 Mini, which cost me £300
Wow.
at the time. Well, in those days, a pound was at about $2.40 to a pound. So that actually cost me, my first race car cost me about $700.
Wow.
And I won my first race in it, and then I did more races. I think I did 6 or 7 races in my first season, and won, if not all of them, at least some of them. Then we got to the end of the year, and I had to sell the car to pay my bills. Mm-hmm. But at least, I got my foot on the first rung of the ladder.
Yes. Oh, what a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that. That is absolutely fantastic. So in a way, even though your friend's mother won the jackpot, you won the jackpot because it got you into racing. Very cool.
Absolutely. I guess that's a nice analogy to put to it.
Yes, absolutely. As we continue on your journey, Vic, I always like to start by asking my guests for a success quote. And this is something that's been instrumental in forming your life and your success. It's a great way to get the inspirational tires turning here on Cars Yeah. So, Vic, take the wheel.
All I can think of is just not aiming for the moon. That's not quite it, but I guess it is to a certain extent, because right from the word go, in my case, and in case of other drivers around that era, there was no yardstick by which to measure ourselves. We could only establish some sort of wish for the future and aim for it.
Yes.
I guess mine perhaps was a little bit higher than most people might have been, and I managed to reach it, or at least most of it. That's all I can say, really.
Well, definitely that shoot for the moon mentality has served you well, because you have driven in so many different types of cars and events that it seems that you just kept shooting for the moon and shooting for the moon. How have you taken that shoot for the moon outlook or mantra or saying forward in your career throughout your life?
And always keeping a positive attitude. For example, one of the things that Anita has, and other people have asked me in the past, especially her, I guess, was how did I feel driving, shall we say, what I knew to be a less than competitive car, for example.
Oh, yes.
In any particular event. My answer to that was always, well, no matter what the car, what I was driving in, I always expected to win.
Ah.
Because even if I was driving an inferior car, I expected by my own admission, I mean, I wouldn't say this publicly, but I would always assume or believe myself that I could produce better driving in that car than anybody else in whatever they were driving, so I was capable of winning. So anytime I started a race, with, I guess, only one or two tiny exceptions, I honestly expected to, if not win, at least do very well, because I thought I was capable of doing it, even if the car on its own wasn't.
Ah, excellent. I love that. Would you share a story with me, Vic, that instigated your passion for cars? Is there one pivotal moment in your life that you realized, I am a car guy, I want to be a racer?
That was that first trip to Silverstone when my dad took me to see the very first British Grand Prix.
Ah, okay, wonderful.
It wasn't the first World Championship. The first World Championship for Formula One actually started in 1950, and this was in 1949 when there were a few. I don't honestly remember how many races, but a few of the old pre-war Formula One races were being re-established to get the sport going again, and that was just one of them.
Fantastic. So, Vic, what I'd love to do now is take a look at some of the roads you've driven down and ask you to share a huge challenge or even a great failure that you faced in your career. But the most important part of this question has to do with how you overcame that situation and, of course, what did you learn from it?
It all comes back to what I've already said a couple of times, just aiming further than I can see, and doing everything I can to get there. First of all, I'm lucky. I didn't have too many accidents. I had a few, but not too many. So I didn't crash very often. And occasionally the car broke. When the car broke, it was just sort of resignation, It happened more than once, and in some cases it was just a question of shrugging shoulders and saying, well, tough. We'll look to the next one. But on one occasion, actually, this is more than just one occasion, and this isn't actually quite covered by your questions, but it is, as you'll understand as I talk about it.
Wonderful.
Way back in the mid-60s, I had been, this was 1966 actually, I'd been driving for Ford of Britain for 3 years, and I'd had a fair amount of success, and then through 65 and particularly into 66, we were driving new Lotus Cortinas in the rally program, and I guess Ford was really trying to do too much with too little at the time. Mm-hmm. And things just started to go wrong, and when things at that level start to go wrong, they tend to be like a snowball rolling downhill. They just get bigger as they go along. Mm-hmm. For example, I won the Rally of the Flowers in Italy in a Lotus Cortina, which was then the Italian national rally, and I promptly got disqualified because Ford had made mistakes on the homologation papers.
Oh, no.
Then it went on like that through the year. In the Coupe des Alpes, which had been always my favourite rally of all time, because it was pure driver skill, rushing up and down mountains all around the French Alps against the clock. And I led the entire way until literally I'm 20 miles from the finish. Not only was I leading in the touring car category with Lotus Cortina up against other, touring cars, Jaguars, etc. I was leading overall in front of Ferraris and Porsches and Maseratis.
Wow. And
20 miles from the end, the car broke.
Oh, no.
So that was a little bit more difficult to stomach.
Yes.
And there had been a couple of other occasions earlier in the year as well, and I got to the point of, having Ford up to there.
Yeah.
And so the finish was actually in Cannes, in France. Mm-hmm. And Huschke von Hanstein, Baron Huschke von Hanstein, who was then competitions manager of Porsche, was there. Porsche did not have any official entries in the rally, the Coupe des Alpes or Alpine Rally, but they were looking after helping a couple of private owners with 911s.
I see.
And the factory had never entered a 911 in anything. Well, they had once, but only as a little sort of look-see. Mm-hmm. They weren't really interested in the 911. just helping out a couple of private owners.
Ah.
So I went to ask him if I could go and see him, and we knew each other vaguely, but not not a great deal at that time. So I went to have lunch with him, and I told him what had been happening at Ford, but of course he knew anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I just got a feeling about the 911. I am positive it's going to be a winner. And
Nice.
he said, well, my boy, actually from that moment onwards, he always called me Vicky or my boy or both. And he said, well, Vicky, my boy, he said, we don't have a rally department. We don't have a budget for rallying. Pierre is not interested in rallying. So I'm afraid, taking you into a rally car is out of the question because it doesn't exist.
Ah.
So I said, well, lend me one.
Yes.
Lend me one for the Tour of Corsica, which is later in the year, October, November time.
Right.
And so he went back to Stuttgart, called me after a couple of weeks, said, okay, I've got permission. We're going to lend you a car for Corsica. That's all. We'll lend you a car. There'll be a mechanic with a little bit of assistance, tyres, wheels, and that sort of thing. But it's all on your own back, your money. We have no money, so you get no expenses, no fee. It's all for you.
Wow.
No practice car, nothing.
Jeez.
Just the rally car. So,
Yeah.
I was giving up a well-paid job with Ford to take on that risk.
Yes.
But I was so convinced that it was going to work, I agreed. So I went off to Corsica. I did a fantastic reconnaissance with a rental car with my co-driver. I was paying all the bills. And then just before the event, the rally car turned up on a trailer behind a van in the port of Bastia up in the north of Corsica. And there was Huschke van Hanstein, my rally car, a couple of mechanics, and I looked in the back of the van, and there were just a few spares, not even just a few spare wheels and a couple of toolboxes and a jack, and that was it. So I said, well, that's very nice, Huschke, but when does the van or something come with the spares?
And that was it.
And he said, well, there are no spares. So I said, well, come on, if I'm going to drive a factory car for Porsche, tell me what breaks or what might break, so at least what it does, I know what it might be. And he said, no, you don't understand. Porsches don't break.
And there you
well,
go.
after what I'd just been through for 3 years with Ford, of course, I was writhing in laughter on the ground.
Yes, a little skeptical.
He was absolutely right. And no production-based 911 I ever drove ever broke.
Wow. What a story.
So I drove my 911. I'd never even driven a 911 until then.
Oh, my
My
goodness.
first drive in a 911 was when I took the start line for the Tour of Corsica in Bastia in 1966.
Wow.
And up against all my French friends, because by then I wasn't living in France, but I already spoke pretty good French, and I liked France, and I got on well with all the French drivers. And in fact, before going to Porsche, I'd seriously thought about going to Alpine Renault, because they knew me, I knew them. Mm-hmm. And then my mind said, oh, careful, however much they like you, you're still not actually a Frenchman.
Yeah.
So they're going to come first. So that was why I went first to Porsche. But then up against all them driving my 911, I finished third.
Wow.
On that event. And that set the ball rolling for a whole future.
It sounds like you may have answered my next question about an aha moment in your career, because that certainly sounded like an aha moment. But what I was going to ask was there a moment in time, and there was probably many, but if you could share one aha moment in your career when something happened, you said, you know what, I think this is really a good idea.
But I suppose we have to go back a little bit further, back to before I even got my first drive. I told you, way back when I was driving for British BMC.
Yes.
Actually, it was even, BMC was even before that, I think. It was probably with Triumph, I can't remember. But way back, the driver I was co-driving, navigating for, was an English driver named David Siegel Morris. And I had just got my first car. My first ever car was an Austin A35, which was, a little bomb at that time.
Yeah.
It was slightly just before the Minis, or about the time of the Minis. And I had my little A35, and this was actually before we went to BNC, I think, because David Siegel Morris at that time, his personal car was a Triumph TR3A.
Oh, okay.
And at one point, we both were going to drive in a hill climb run by what was then the London Motor Club. And this was a hill climb. I honestly don't remember where it was, how long it was. Just a fairly small hill climb somewhere close to London. I can't remember how many, what hills there are that require racing up close to London. But it was probably like a 2 or 3 mile hill climb, probably taking a minute and a half or something like that.
Yeah.
And David and I decided, since we were together so much, we would enter both cars and we would both drive both cars.
Cool.
His and mine. And I beat him in both of them.
Great.
This was my driver, and so for a long time I'd been telling myself I was going to be a racing driver, and now I was able to say, I guess in your language, aha.
Aha, yes. Now, Vic, I'm sure you've had many proud moments in your career, but is there one in particular that stands out you could share with us?
Oh, yeah. Winning the Monte Carlo rally for Porsche.
Ah.
Not so much just winning it, but because of the circumstances.
And what were those?
Well, in 1960, I'll go back a bit, 1966, I just had my first trip in the 911, then that led to the whole year in 1967 driving for the factory and then getting incorporated into the race team as well as rallying. 1967 Monte Carlo with Porsche. Now, suddenly they were on my side.
Yes.
Suddenly there was a program for a 911. Although I was the only one driving one. I was a one-man band throughout the year. But in Monte Carlo, I led the whole way until the very, very last special stage over the Col de Turini, which everybody in rallying knows about. And I got caught with the wrong tyres as it snowed. It wasn't supposed to snow, but it did. And I had the wrong tyres, and there was no way to change those tyres. So I dropped from first place back to third, because a couple of the front-wheel drive cars, one Lancia, one Mini, they go much better on snow and ice if they got the wrong tyres. They're not as good if they've got the right tyres, but the wrong tyres, they can still keep going quite well. Sure. And they passed me.
Oh no.
So then we went through that year. I won more rallies. I was European champion, and everything was going well. And then we went back to Monte Carlo in 1968. And once again, I was driving a Porsche 911. Now, Porsche had got now 2 cars. Pauli Toivonen from Finland was in the other one, my teammate. And once again, I pulled out all the stops, and there was just something about Monte Carlo and Porsche and me that worked.
Yep.
And when we got through the whole first part of the rally in Monte Carlo, I was leading again, or at least right up there in the top. And then the last night in Monte Carlo, back then, it's changed a bit now, but the last night was a 400-mile road race around the French mountains in the Alpes Maritimes, the Maritime Alps, just above Monte Carlo.
Okay.
With 2 or 3 runs over the Col de Turini, a couple over the Col de la Quiole and other places, all against the clock. Mm-hmm. So, flat out road racing at night.
Wow.
In whatever conditions there were, ice and snow and so on. And after the previous year, we set off that night, and I was just all sort of tensed up and nervous. And my co-driver, David Stone, we'd been together a long time then, so we knew each other well. He was he was probably, in those days, one of the 2 best co-drivers in the world.
Awesome.
The other one, his name is certainly familiar to. The other one was a man named Jean Todt.
Oh, yes.
And you know who Jean Todt is?
Yes.
That was at the level at which I put my David Stone. They were the 2 best. Jean Todt with the French drivers and David Stone with me. Cool. And then later on with others. But we set off in Monte Carlo. I was all tensed up and a bit nervous, and I actually lost time to my teammate and to even 1 or 2 of the Renault Alpine drivers on the first special stage. And then we had a long run up, of probably an hour and a half drive up basically main roads to the little town of Saint-Sauveur before going over the Col de la Quiole, which again was one of these up one side and down the other side against the clock.
Mm-hmm.
And on the way up there, David started giving me a lecture and settling me down. And he said, look, we came out last night to check our notes. We went over the whole route. We know there might be less snow than last night, but there cannot be more. You know you're the fastest in the mountains anyway. So forget about any problems. Just relax. Forget about last year. We know we're going to be unbeatable.
Mm-hmm.
And so we set off on this, on the Col de la Quiole, and I went on racing tyres, even though we knew there would be some snow and ice in one of the two patches. Mostly it was going to be dry or just damp. And we blew everybody away. I went a minute quicker than the next car.
Wow.
In a 17-minute section.
Nice.
And when we got to the bottom, I used to smoke like a chimney back then as well, Mark, but we got to the bottom. It took me about 10 minutes before I could actually get my hands still enough to light a cigarette.
Oh, gosh.
We drove off. And so we won the rally on that. And I guess the proudest moment was then the actual prize giving in front of the palace at Monte Carlo, up on the hill at the palace itself, and receiving all our trophies from Princess Grace and Prince Renier.
Wow.
And all the three little kids as they were then around. And that was a real proud moment because I figured for once I had virtually done that on my own.
Yes. Wow.
Because I had developed the car over the previous year when Porsche wasn't interested. By that time, I was literally building or at least designing my own cars in terms of gearboxes, because there were lots of variables available. And with the guy who was in charge at Porsche doing it, I literally was designing my own cars by then. So I thought this was something I'd really, really done, almost, obviously not single-handed, that's not possible, but leading the whole parade, if you like.
Yes. Oh, wonderful. Fantastic. Let's have a little bit of fun here. You've driven so many different kinds of cars, but is there one in particular that you could call exceptionally special that you drove and raced that you would share with us?
Oh, absolutely. This usually starts with this question, which then goes to another. The answer to that question is simply the Porsche 917.
Ah, yes.
To which the next question is, if you're like everybody else, which one?
Yes. Okay, I will ask you which one.
Well, to which the answer is, believe it or not, all of them.
Oh, gosh.
Because the very first 917 in 1969, it almost happened by accident because the FIA was concerned about the speeds being reached by prototypes at Le Mans, especially Le Mans. And so they wanted to cut down on the very, very high top speeds that prototypes were reaching.
Mm-hmm.
So they decided that prototype race cars would be limited to a 3-litre engine limit from 1969 onwards, and so as not to make all of the existing cars. I mean, there were Aston Martins, Ford GT40s, for example, big Lolas, so as not to make them all obsolete overnight. They created a new category called the sports category, as opposed to prototype. Mm-hmm. And the sports category originally was going to be that the manufacturer had to make a minimum of 50 cars in order to be homologated. Well, Porsche and Ferrari together both said, well, that's a little bit too much. So they both went to the FIA together and said, let's make it 25. Mm-hmm. And the FIA said, okay, 25. So you've got to make 25 of these cars, and they can have engines up to 5 litres.
Nice.
Instead of 3 litres.
Mm-hmm.
So along came the Ferrari 512s,
yes,
which had an immediate 5-litre engine, the Porsche 917, which initially had a 4.5-litre engine, although it rapidly grew to 5 litres.
Sure.
And these were the cars. So in 1969, Porsche really only wanted to enter one of these cars for Le Mans, driven by Ross Summerlin, as a pure test car, knowing that it was going to break after 6 hours. Summerlin was going to be able to drive it flat out, no problem, until it broke.
Yep.
But I was convinced that it was going to be a winning car as well, so I kept on and on and on to Ferdinand Piech, who was a good friend of mine. He and I got along very well together then. Nice. And Helmut Bopp, who was in charge of that program as well, to let me have one. And they kept saying, no, Vic, you want to win Le Mans, have a 908. And I kept on, and eventually they said, okay, you can have one, but you know it's going to break. And I said, no, I think if we look after it very, very carefully, we can get it to the end.
Yeah.
And one of the things about it was, one of the things that attracted me was its pure speed. You know, at that time, the 908s were like everything else. Nobody had ever gone over around 200 miles an hour at that time, including the 908s. They topped out at about 195, 200 miles an hour. But the first 917, even this first nasty, and it was nasty, 917, was capable of around 220 miles an hour.
Wow.
It was a pretty nasty car to drive. It wandered all over the road at that speed, but it still was 20 miles an hour quicker than anything else. My philosophy, along with that of Piet, was also, when we went to Le Mans, for example, we both agreed that the last thing we wanted to do at Le Mans was race. We simply wanted a car that was quicker than everything else, so we didn't need to race.
Wow.
If I wanted to get by the car in front, I didn't have to race him into a corner. I simply waited till the next corner, drove round the next corner, and then drove by.
Man.
And even with that horrible car, that worked.
Yeah.
And Richard Atwood and I treated it with kid gloves. We treated it gently. And after 21 hours, just a little less than 3 hours from the end, we were leading by 50 miles.
My goodness.
5-0.
Yes.
And the bell housing cracked.
Oh, jeez.
So the clutch got oil on it, and that was the end of our race. But that was also a pretty proud moment, not just for me, but for the Porsche guys. Our pit, of course, was right in front of the major grandstand, and when that happened, it put the car out of the race. So this German car, driven by a couple of Brit drivers, was pushed away by the German mechanics, and the entire grandstand stood up and gave it a round of applause.
What a wonderful story. I got goosebumps. Fantastic. Now, here's a question for you, Vic. Is there a car that you...
Hold on.
Oh, yes.
Go on.
Oh, please do.
That was just the first year.
Oh, my goodness.
And then I said, that was the first 917 that was my favorite car. Then, of course, we went on from there. By the following year, when we were driving in all the other races, except Le Mans, everywhere else, we were driving the classic short-tail coupe cars, which had been developed into arguably the nicest, best, not necessarily the fastest, but well, in some cases, but the best race car of all time. They were not easy to drive, but they weren't difficult by racing car standards. They were just wonderful to drive. The drivers had tremendous faith in them, tremendous confidence in them, and so that was, the next step as being part of the best car ever. And then the other one was the Longtail 917. In 1970, I was the only one who chose to drive the 5-litre Longtail at Le Mans. And once again, that car stood out because I was the first driver ever to go round Le Mans at an average of over 150 mile an hour in that car.
Oh, geez.
So you can see why every single version of the 917 was my favorite car.
I have to say, I understand completely. My goodness, that is incredible. Now, here's a question for you. Is there a car that you've owned in your life that you sold that you really wish you could have back?
I was never a collector of cars. I drove them. I enjoyed them. For example, when we came to the end of the 917 era, John Wyer by then was running what was essentially the factory team under the Gulf colours, and of course he had quite a number of 917s. And we came to the end of the 917 era. By the end of 1971, it was no longer a homologated car. It was basically either scrap or a collector's car. And John Wyer was literally coming around to all of us at that time, arm on the shoulder, Vic, my boy, wouldn't you like to buy a nice 917.
Oh my gosh.
Take home, look wonderful at home, sitting in your garage.
Yes.
And we're saying, yeah, John, what the hell do you think I'm going to do with a 917?
Right.
Oh, Vic, it would look lovely. Only $10,000.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
The last time my Sebring winning car was sold, I think it was sold for about $4 million.
Yes. Oh yes. Cars have just gotten crazy.
And Bruce Cannabar has got one on. I don't know if he sold it, but he had one for sale recently, and I don't even know what the price was on that.
No, you don't even want to ask.
Yeah.
He still has that car for sale. Yep. Somebody with a big checkbook will get
to
it.
answer your question,
Yep.
of all the cars that I've owned, in 1968, Joe Sifford and I were the first to have a contract for the year to drive for Porsche, and we weren't paid a lot of money, although what we were paid we thought then was pretty good. Mm-hmm. By today's standards, it was peanuts.
Yeah.
But we had a salary and a car.
Nice.
And that was my first Porsche that I ever owned. It was a 2.2 litre. It had the Sportomatic transmission, which I chose because I was actually still living in London then. You know the Sportomatic where
yes.
you actually change gear but didn't have a clutch pedal.
Right.
I just loved that car. And so I think if I could go back, and it still exists, it belongs to some people that I know quite well in England, and they've had it for donkey's years. If a guy could go back and have one single car that I ever owned, it would be that one.
Awesome. Now, here's a very introspective question for you, Vic. If you were, and I'm going to say, I asked most of my guests if you were a car, but I'm going to ask you, if Vic Elford was a race car, which race car would he be?
Then I think that's comparatively easy. I never actually got to it yet, but we would have done ultimately. I would have been a 91730 Porsche Can-Am car.
Oh, wow. So that car was never created.
I'm the only driver who ever drove every single version of the 917.
Oh, my goodness. I didn't know that. Wow.
Well, I drove the very first undrivable monster that we talked about earlier.
Yep.
In 1969. Then I drove the Short Tails in 1970, from then on. But then in 1971, 70 and 71, I drove the 5-litre Long Tails at Le Mans. And then later on, I did it a one-off race, but I drove the 91730 Can-Am car in one of the inter-series Can-Am type races in Europe at Hockenheim. And
wow.
I won.
Wow. Very cool.
The person who drove them all. And that car was the absolute ultimate.
Oh, fantastic. All right, Vic, we're about to enter the last lap. But before we do, here's a little something for the Cars Yeah listeners. Do you love vintage cars? Then go to carsyeah.com and get a free copy of the fantastic Filler Up book. It's a full-color ebook filled with fuel filler fun, with over 60 color photographs of vintage cars, plus inspirational quotes from some of the most famous automotive enthusiasts of all time. Simply go to carsyeah.com and click on the free book button on the homepage. Download your free Filler Up book today at Cars Yeah. All right, Vic, we're entering what I call the last lap here, and this is where I'm going to fire off a series of questions to you and ask you to give our listeners some very quick blips of the throttle answers. So are you ready to go?
I'm ready. I'm just looking at your little list of the last lap.
Okay. Awesome.
I'll try and do it.
Okay. All right. What is the best automotive advice you ever received?
It might well have been Marcus Chambers, the competitions manager at BMC, as I told you, who fired me because I wanted to be a driver and he didn't want he didn't want co-drivers who wanted to be drivers, and basically telling me he fired me so that I would actually go and get on with it and do it on my own.
There you go.
I needed a push to go and do it.
Would you share with me one of your personal habits that you believe has contributed to your success?
I guess this goes back to rallies originally, but it carries over into racing too, circuit racing. I was always looking for absolute 100% success. In rallies, for example, that came down to pace notes. I'm not going to go into detail because we'll be here for another half now. But the pace notes that I used with my friend and co-driver David Stone, Actually, they'd been started by BMC originally, but then we took them over basically and carried on. And we developed them to such a point that we were unbeatable on them. And even in today's Europe or World Championship rallying, the Scandinavians or the British drivers, they all tend to use what are basically or were basically the notes that David Stone and I created.
Wow.
The Europeans, the French in particular and the Italians, they use a different system. But my system is one that is still used by the Brits and the Scandinavians.
Wow.
To give you an example of what we meant by perfection, one time, I think it was 1972 or 73, I don't remember which year, I was driving a Ferrari Daytona in the Tour de France. Now, a Ferrari Daytona, as I'm sure you know, the racing version anyway, is a monster car.
Yes.
Noisy, I'm not being rude here, but a real man's car. It was a real handful.
Yes.
And we had one special stage. On the Tour de France, there were probably 6, 7, 8, 10 racetracks that we used to go to all around the France. And this wasn't a day and night thing. We would drive, we would race on a track for an hour, race, and we'd drive off somewhere else. And we would have probably about 10 one-hour races. And then interspersed with that, a number of rally-type special stages, which usually meant racing up one side of a mountain and going down the other side. So there was no advantage to being a big car or a small car. It evened itself out.
Yeah.
And on one occasion, we had a special stage down in the Pyrenees Mountains, on the Spanish-French border. And this was a mountain. I'd never seen it. I'd never been there.
Wow.
David went down there. Took a rental car, a little portable, speakerphone type thing, recorded his own, read out or created pace notes driving up and over the mountain, went back to the hotel, wrote them out, and then went back driving one-handed, driving one-eyed while he's reading out pace notes to himself as he went and correcting them until he got them as perfect as he could.
Sure.
And that was it. I'd never seen the thing, and I had absolute total trust in our notes and him reading them. And we did this test at around 6 o'clock in the morning. It was misty, it was raining, foggy. There was Georgia-type red clay mud running across the road, which was not the ideal situation for our Ferrari Daytona.
I'll bet.
And we set the fastest time.
Wow. It worked.
So, that's another of those personal habits, if you like, this quest for perfection, which we attained on that occasion.
Oh, fantastic. Now, I know there are a lot of resources these days with the internet, but is there one in particular you're really fond of? Maybe a website that you enjoy, or maybe a blog that you get on a regular basis you could share with our listeners?
There is one magazine that I recommend.
Okay.
In particular, and that's a British magazine called Motorsport.
Yes, wonderful.
Which is, in my opinion, without doubt, the best all-round motorsport magazine in the world.
Yes, yeah, it is. I've subscribed to that magazine for years. I really enjoy it. Now, how about books? I know this could be tough, but is there one book in particular that you think our listeners should get their hands on?
Absolutely. Mine.
And what is the title of your book? Could you share that?
I wrote two. The first one, way back, this is over 20 years ago. I'm sure you know the author Randy Leffingwell, who is a fountain of books, especially about Porsche.
Yes.
Way back, I think it was 1993. Randy Leffingwell wrote a book called Porsche Legends, and he asked me to write the foreword for it, which I did. And when he sent his manuscript to what was then Motorbooks came back to me and they said, "Look, you write very well. We've read your foreword. Thank you very much. Why don't you write a book for us?"
Cool.
And they came up with one or two possible ideas on history. I said, "No, I can't do that. People like Randy Leffingwell, there's no way I could compete with authors of that caliber." And so Motorbooks said, "Well, why don't you, because everybody talks about this as being difficult, write a how to drive a Porsche book." So I said, "Okay, I'll do that. I can do that." So I wrote a book called the Porsche High Performance Driving Handbook. and it was published in February 1994.
Nice.
It still sells.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now in February 2015, it is still selling.
Wonderful.
And selling well. After all this time, it's now in its second edition. The first edition lasted for a long, long time. I updated it with a second edition. I guess I don't honestly remember when, but it was about without leaving you and going to look. I can't remember, but probably around 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I went down to the Porsche driving school in Alabama and went through driving all of their latest models, to get used to the upgrades in electronics and hydraulics and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And although it's called the Porsche High Performance Driving Handbook, it's actually it's about driving everything, no matter what you drive, whether you drive a rear-wheel drive 911 or a front-wheel drive Honda Accord or whatever, anything else in between. It covers absolutely every aspect of driving safely and driving fast.
Wonderful. Well, I have both your books on my library shelves. They're fantastic, and I'll tell our listeners here, you can find links to all these resources, including these two great books, at carsyeah.com/Vic Elford. All right, Vic, we're up to the checkered flag, and this last question can be a real doozy for some people. If you could have only one collector car in your garage, but don't worry about the price, because today I will buy you whatever you'd like, what would that one vehicle that you would choose be, and why?
Well, after all I've talked about it and said about it, I'm trying to think which one it would be.
I know it's difficult with.
Well, actually, it's actually two cars, which are actually one car.
Okay.
I'll explain. In 1970, I drove the very first and only 5-litre Longtail at Le Mans.
Mm-hmm.
Gerard Larousse drove a Longtail in the hippie colours, but his was with the smaller 4.5-litre engine.
Okay. I
drove mine with the 5-litre engine. It's in the Steve McQueen film, because I led the first lap, obviously. It's shown in I was on pole position, and it's shown in the McQueen film. It's white with red flashes on the front and on the rear winglets and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said earlier, with that car, I was the first ever to lap Le Mans at over 150 mile an hour average.
Wow.
Then fast forward to 1971, and I was again driving a 5-litre 917 Longtail it was number 21. In my opinion, perhaps the most beautiful race car ever built, in the Martini racing colours.
Oh, yeah.
As I say, Longtail, number 21. I've got it sitting on my wall just behind me, actually. And in fact, it would be those two, but those two are in fact the same car.
Oh, very cool. Two in one.
Not too many people know it, but the 1970 car, which ran as a almost pure white with red flashes car in the Austrian colours, then became the Martini car in the beautiful Martini colours. And so that is the car, if I was going to buy it, keep it, never sell it again, it would be that car as it appeared in the second edition in the Martini colours.
Oh, wonderful choice. And great story behind that choice, too. Fantastic. Vic, you have taken me on a great ride today, and I have so enjoyed your stories. I knew this would be a fantastic discussion, and I want to thank you for sharing your journey with me and the Cars Yeah listeners. Is there one parting piece of guidance you might offer our listeners before you drive off down the racetrack in that Martini 917?
Just a summary of everything, of pretty well everything we've been talking about. Whatever it is you're aiming at, whether it's driving a race car or flying an aeroplane or sailing a boat or anything else for that matter. When I was a kid, my parents insisted, because it was the thing to do, my parents insisted I learn to play the piano, which was an absolute disaster because I'm not in the slightest bit musical in any way whatsoever. And so I had to go to weekly lessons and try and learn to play the piano. Mm-hmm. It didn't work, of course, partly because there was no intention there was no passion on my part to learn to play the piano.
Yep.
So I think whatever it is you want to do, make sure pick the thing you want to do, and more or less how you want to do it, and just go for it. Don't give up until you get there.
Yes, fantastic advice. And what's the best way for our listeners to follow what you're doing these days? You mentioned you had a website?
Yes, I have a website. My website is vicelford.com.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Just VICELFORD.com. And if people forget, they just type me into Google and you'll find me. And my wife runs a Facebook page as well.
Wonderful.
Oh, you know about it because you've been talking to her on Facebook.
I do. And I'll make...
You can tell your listeners how to get there because I have no idea. I have no idea how Facebook works.
That's okay. Absolutely. Listeners, you can find links on Vic's show notes page at carsyeah.com/Vic Elford. Just put Vic into the search bar. His show notes page will pop up. You can find links to his Facebook page, and you can find his website and follow what Vic is up to. Vic, thank you so much for being so generous today with your time and your expertise and for sharing your experiences with me and the listeners. It's been an absolute treasure for me today. Until we talk again, I'll see you down the road.
Hold on. I would like to say just thank you as well, Mark. Thank you for getting to me. I've really enjoyed it. I know it's been you and me talking, but I can almost feel people out there listening to what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
It's always a great pleasure to know that people are listening and hopefully enjoying some of the things we're talking about.
I'm sure you're very welcome. I'm sure they're going to enjoy this a great deal.
Our pets are a big part of our family, and we love to take them everywhere we go, but they can be very hard on your vehicle's interiors. If you add the fall and winter weather, you'll end up with water, mud, snow, and a whole lot more that Fido tracks into your cars. Covercraft offers a wide variety of solutions to protect your vehicle's interior from fall and winter's rough treatment, and Fido's too. Canine cargo area covers are padded for your pet's comfort and provide door-to-door protection. Pet pads have built-in features to keep cargo areas and seats well protected, and they're easy to clean. Covercraft's quality pet solutions cover cargo areas, bucket or bench seats, and protects from the damaging claws, pet fur, hair, mud, moisture, drool from permanently damaging your vehicles. Choose from a variety of styles and covers for almost every vehicle made. And here's a special deal for you Cars Yeah listeners. If you use the code YEAH21 at covercraft.com, you'll get 10% off your Covercraft order. What a deal. Covercraft, protecting the things that move you and making life a lot easier with the pets we love so much. Covercraft. Years ago, when it was time to renew my collector car insurance policy, my carrier's rates went up, way up, but my usage was the same and I never made a claim. I didn't even have a ticket. So what's with that? So I turned to American Collectors Insurance. Has your collector car insurance recently raised your rates for no good reason? Tired of paying an annual membership fee? Then it's time to look around and call American Collectors Insurance. I shopped around, I asked friends for recommendations, and found a winner that I can trust. And boy, I'm glad I did. I saved hundreds of dollars every year and slept better at night knowing my baby was properly insured. American Collectors Insurance have been protecting vehicles since 1976. They provided me with an agreed value insurance policy backed by their history of taking great care of their clients. What could be better than that? So give them a call and ask for a quote today. 866-ACI-YEAH. That's 866-224-9324. And protect the ones you love like I did with American Collectors Insurance. Classic car insurance designed by collectors for collectors. For several years now, you've heard me talk about Linkage Magazine. I've been a subscriber since the start. Their talented and creative team brings you a spectacular publication and website that shares the automotive passion from a worldwide perspective. Linkage is about driving, restoring, collecting, and first-hand experience at collector car auctions and more. They bring you real-world values plus rational, experienced opinions on the current markets. They cover the automotive world and the people who share our passions. And Linkage Magazine has grown, mailing you 6 issues annually. Join me on this journey with Linkage. They're geared for the automotive life. You can subscribe at linkagemag.com.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's ride here at Cars Yeah. Drive on over to carsyeah.com to find show notes and inspiring automotive fun. Download your free copy of Filler Up, a fun book filled with gorgeous photographs of fuel filler fun, including quotes from more inspiring automotive enthusiasts. Download your copy today, and we'll see you next time on Cars Yeah.